Aaron, we have the same shirt on almost today, huh?
I guess so.
Team coordination. So thank you to the team, obviously, for inviting us to come and present to you guys. Aaron and I were excited to be a part of this program and are very excited to go to Brazil on Saturday. Are you flying Saturday as well, Aaron? Or when are you flying to Brazil?
On Sunday morning.
Exactly. So we're going to be spending obviously 2 weeks in Brazil. It's going to be my first time. We're going to be going to Web Summit in Rio and then obviously to Sao Paulo afterwards. And excited to obviously meet the teams there in person as well. Maybe just before we go into the presentation today, which will be led by Aaron, maybe we should do some short introductions so you get a little bit more context to who we are. So I'll just start first, and then I'll punt it over in American terms to Aaron afterwards to kind of drive the conversation today. But my name is Klaus, or Klausinho, as my Brazilian friends call me, or I'm actually called on Slack as well. I often say that I've lived and worked on 4 different continents. I've lived and worked in Santiago, Chile, Hanoi, Vietnam. I'm from Denmark, up the Nordics, or the sort of the Nordic Brazilians, if you will, when it comes to soccer. We're really good at soccer sometimes. And then I live in Silicon Valley right now. And so I've been here for the last decade in the Bay Area. And the majority of my work has been around supporting international entrepreneurs connect to the Silicon Valley ecosystem, helping to educate them around entrepreneurship, but also understand how to scale in and expand into the Bay Area. And before, actually, I was helping Carlsberg, a very big corporation, a big beer brewing company, to relaunch in Vietnam. So when it comes to international growth and expansion, I have some experience, I would say, not just on the entrepreneurship side, guiding entrepreneurs coming into Silicon Valley, but also inside a big corporation. And so for the past 10 years in the Bay Area, Aaron and myself, I think accumulatively, we worked with around 2,000 founders from more than 50 countries. And so we have extensive, work in this field. And that's also part of the reason for why we decided to write the book Global Class. Do I have it handy here, Aaron? You probably have it handy somewhere on your table. Which is a 2-year extensive work interviewing top executives from the fastest growing companies in the world to identify patterns of success and patterns of failures, distilled into very practical tools and concepts to hopefully help you guys communicate the path to international growth. And so we basically interviewed the top brands and top executives, everything from the head of international Zoom to the former VP of international Apple, and to the first hire outside of North America for Uber, to the founder of Rocket Chat, to the founder of Pipefy from Brazil as well, to really just understand how that it made them successful building for global markets. And so part of what we're going to be doing today is to share that with you all. In the first session today, Aaron will be giving you the high level, the walkthrough on the main concepts of the global class. That's going to be the first session today in about, I think, around 40 to 45 minutes. And then on later this week, we're going to be doing an exercise on something called the Business Model Localization Canvas, which is a canvas we have developed to help frame things for founders to understand how they should expand, but also localize the business for international markets. And so part of the exercise there will be helping to identify key questions that you have in mind when you want to explore other international countries, that then will direct you in terms of also who to talk to for your localization efforts as well. And so Aaron will be scratching the surface on this tool in today's presentation as well, and I'll go a little bit deeper with you all later this week. I'll stop there and I will punt it over to my good friend Aaron and my longtime partner. And Aaron, I'll let you take the lead now.
Cool. Thanks, Klaus. So a little background on me. I'm a Silicon Valley native. I started my career at AT&T as part of its leadership development program, sort of future C-level program, worked in a number of areas, was one of the youngest to serve as regional vice president. But I always knew in my heart that I was an entrepreneur. So I left, became a serial entrepreneur, started a number of companies. Some of them failed. 3 of them got acquired. One of them was on the television show in the United States called Shark Tank that you might have heard of, which was a fun experience we can talk about later. And then about 6, almost 7 years ago, I was asked to teach entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, where I still teach today. And then about 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago or so, Klaus and I had co-founded 10X Innovation Lab. So just to get into content, let me confirm. Can everyone see my screen? Yes?
Yes, we can, Aaron.
Perfect. All right. So we'll go through a few different slides. At any time, if you have a question or otherwise, please feel free to stop me. Not a problem at all. So there's nice pictures of Klaus and I you can see here. And this is a little bit more around the book that Klaus was talking a bit about. And so as Klaus was mentioning, we in our work, we work with companies all across the world, and a lot of them wanting to connect into Silicon Valley, expand in the United States. And we noticed a lot of mistakes that they had made. One of the jokes I kind of like to tell is an entrepreneur would come to, or executive would come to Silicon Valley, get to the airport, expect to pick up their luggage at the baggage claim, and expect there to be a venture capitalist there to give them a multi-million-dollar check. It's not quite how it works, right? So a lot of misconceptions on things, a lot of issues, a lot of time and money wasted. And then the pandemic hit. And as Klaus had mentioned, that sort of set us off on this journey. We weren't traveling like we normally do. And so we virtually traveled and talked to these hundreds of different executives from all these different markets. And we realized there was no book on international business expansion that had really, hit the core of business, focused specifically on international. There's Good to Great, 0 to 1, Lean Startup, these type of books, but nothing really specifically on international business expansion. And that's where we had all of these conversations with all of these top brands, companies that you've heard of, to figure out what they did to be successful. And it ended up that, also just for context, this is, we think it's a crucial time right now. We see there's a pivot happening in business. The analogy we like to use is comparing today to the 1990s with the dot-com boom. As you probably know, what happened was the companies that were born before versus after thought, acted, operated very differently. And those that took advantage of the power of the internet won out in a lot of markets. And we think that pivot point today is not the internet. That pivot point is around global expansion, is around distributed teams, and is around looking international, not just for sources of inexpensive labor, but actual developed economies. Like one of the statistics that we like to share is in sub-Saharan Africa, there are over 500 million people under the age of 19. And within the next 10 years or so, that number will be over 1 billion. And so there's just a ton of opportunity these different places. And what we think is, in the same way today, every company has a website, right? That's normal. Well, back, during the dot-com boom, companies would debate this. Should we have a website? I don't know. What should we do? Of course you have a website today. Right now, a lot of companies are debating, should we go international? What do we do? We think in a few years, all companies inherently are going to be international. And you need to build your company. You need to build that DNA in the company from the beginning to be successful doing that. And so in all this research we did, we basically found that everyone was reinventing the wheel. There was a lot of time and a lot of money wasted doing things the wrong way. And a number of the people we talked to, they came from fancy consulting firms like McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and Bain and others. And those people told us, when I went into these operational executive roles or I founded businesses, I didn't know how to do this. There were no frameworks from these top consulting firms to tell us what to do. And so that led us down this path then of creating a lot of these. And raise your hand if you have heard of the Lean Startup or know who Eric Ries is. Okay, some hands. Okay, so for those who aren't familiar, the Lean methodology being more iterative as opposed to a waterfall approach where you take all the specifications, you build everything in silos, you go to market, being much more iterative. And it's because of Eric that we use words like minimum viable product or MVP. We use words like iterate, pivot, product market fit. But he didn't invent these concepts. A lot of them actually came from Japanese Kaizen manufacturing principles from the 1970s and 80s. But he created this common language and set of frameworks. And so that's what we've done when it comes to international expansion. And so I won't go through all of these, but there are a lot of things we found there were common mistakes companies made when they were expanding to new markets. And this is not the full list. There are definitely other points of failure, things that caused that failure, but we heard these time and time again. Things like attempting to be born global, attempting to launch everywhere at once. We don't think it works that way. This us versus them mentality between headquarters and local teams, building the wrong teams, not building the foundation to support growth, not thinking about the universality of company culture or core values. A lot of these problems end up catching up with you later if you don't build from the beginning. And one of the things that we found, there's obviously a lot of cultural differences, but one of the similar things between companies that come from the countries like the US and Brazil is because the home market is so big, you often don't think about international until much later in the growth process. And so everything is very hard-coded, to use a tech term, software term, hard-coded for the home market. So you built things for a Brazilian customer base, for Brazilian regulations, for operating a Brazilian company, for having core values and a culture that fits Brazilian employees. And sometimes if you don't build appropriately, it can create problems when you attempt to expand. So what we did was we basically designed a certain mindset that we found in common, both at the company level and individual level, the right team building strategies, the right balance, especially when it comes to localization and balancing differences in culture, and then creating the right structures and management in order to support scale. And so that's what we're going to be going through over the next few minutes that we have together. And we wrap all of this into this concept we call being a global class company, playing on the words best in class, first class, world class. And we found that there was this common mindset that these companies who have been successful at reaching scale globally have versus companies that think, in what we call the legacy way of doing things. And so from a vision perspective, the legacy mindset is often having a home market bias. And this is pretty natural, right? It's well, we came from this country. That's the way things are done in this country. That's what made us successful in this country. And that may be true, but and you guys may have heard of this. There's a pretty famous book by a gentleman named Jeffrey Moore, and he talks about it. It's called Crossing the Chasm. And he talks about going from early adopter customers to more of a mass market and how there's a big chasm, like a big canyon, a big gap in between. And a similar type gap exists between success in one country and success globally. And the way you do things in each place cannot be the same. They have to be a bit different. But what often happens is companies have an ego around it. They say, well, this is what made us successful. This is the company way of doing things. We're going to do it this way. And if you attempt to do that, you're going to run into problems when you come up against differences in local markets. So what we found is these global class companies, they think global day one. Emphasis on the word think. You cannot attempt to be global day one. You need to find validation in one market first. Otherwise, you're just going to go around forever, never getting footing and traction in a market. But you can build your product, your team, your processes, your company culture, all of it in ways that can be localized and or universalized. We also have there's a more decentralized view on talent. The legacy mindset is to hire people to be physically located either at headquarters or clustered in one of our regional headquarters. Global class companies realize that the best talent is everywhere, especially after the pandemic, spread out everywhere. So they hire the best talented person wherever they happen to be and use them not just for their functional expertise, but to better understand and gain entry into new markets. And then there's also a new role of headquarters. So traditionally, headquarters before the pandemic for a lot of companies was a single building where the whole power structure of a company sat. That's not necessarily true anymore. Companies are, leaders from companies are spread out. And so it creates this unique opportunity for headquarters to not be a command and control mechanism, telling everyone what to do. You do this, we're doing it this way, but more to be an enabler and supporter of the different models that need to operate in other markets in order to help them truly be successful in penetrating those markets. And so if you go back to this view, like an overarching strategy and often a view of fast-growing companies, is this shift in what disruption means, or the focus on disruption. The example we often give is Uber. Uber said, we are going to take our model that worked in the United States, and we are going to shove it down the throat of every single city in this world, and we're going to ask for forgiveness later. That is not the way to build a global company. Nowadays, it is much more important to understand the local way of doing things and adapt to be more of a contributor to the ecosystems that you're part of. So let's tie some of these concepts together. So has anybody ever heard of a company called BlaBlaCar? Any hands? Couple of hands. Okay. World's largest carpooling platform. Not particularly successful in the United States because people don't like to carpool as much in the United States. But their CEO, founder here, Frederick Mazzala. So Frederick is a great example of thinking global very early on. So at the very beginning, the company's name actually was, and I don't speak French, was covoiturage, which means carpooling in French. I imagine most of us on the call here could not properly say that in French. It's a hard word to say. Understanding that, they came up with a new name. No matter what language you speak, people can say blah, blah, right? So BlaBlaCar became much easier to say, much more of a universal name. Another example of that on the bad side, there's a company that you may have heard of that is the #1 messaging platform in Korea that's called PqTec. Has anybody ever heard of PqTec? Correct. Part of the reason why is they chose a name that is terrible in a lot of languages. In a lot of languages, it sounds like caca, like poop, right? So people think it's like shit talking, right? So it's not a good name for other markets, but they have not been successful outside of Korea because they have such Korean mindedness. But that wasn't the only thing that was localized. So BlaBlaCar had what they called a build for 2 markets strategy. So they're from France, but they thought about the Spanish market from very early on. So they literally hired people from Spain, moved them to headquarters in France. And when they were developing their product and strategizing, they had that influence from that Spanish team. So not only did they get good feedback on things, but as strategy was developed, they had that right input. And you may not think that's a big deal, but it's powerful because if you think about it, if they didn't have that influence, they would have built an app that just considered the French language in the user interface. Well, they had to think about the Spanish language as well. They would have just thought about regulation around transportation in France. They had to think about Spain as well. And so what happened was then when it became time for them to expand into Spain, that team who had moved there moved back. And then they had, not only did they have the company knowledge, which we'll talk about later, to know how to get things done and trust built, but they were then able to take that model that already had the Spanish market considered and launch it. So then when it came time to add country 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it was very easy because not everything was hard-coded for that French market. We also found that there was a set of commitments that these companies made that helped enable them to be successful in growing in other markets and reaching global scale. And the top left is resource alignment. And so this is not just giving money toward a launch, but is over a sustained period of time, not 9 or 12 months, but 2 or 3 years, or even longer, committing to a market and giving the necessary resources for you to get traction in that market. And one thing that we found some companies did was they actually set milestones to unlock additional amounts of capital over time. And those often weren't necessarily revenue or profit metrics. They were around more qualitative product market fit things, around launching a certain capability or developing a certain partnership or hitting some kind of operational goal locally. On the top right, another key commitment was around trust and autonomy. Especially early on in the expansion process, you need to be able to give teams the right level of autonomy to uncover the localizations needed to be successful in that market. And the way we break this down is we say that there's 3 stages of expansion. One is market entry. You're first going into the market. The goal, the end point of market entry is product market fit. Does everybody know what product market fit is? Do I need to define? We know it? Yes? Okay. All right. So product market fit, scalable business, profitable business, you validated that. Then during the market growth stage, that's where you need to be able to, one, continue to penetrate the market, but be more mindful of other markets that you're expanding into, the overarching strategy of expansion the company is doing. The end of that market growth stage is what we call company market fit. So it takes product market fit and it layers on cultural fit and operational fit in that country on top of that. And then eventually you get into market maturity. And this is where you're pushing for deeper market penetration. So you have to localize even more to capture more than just that top level of low-hanging fruit customer to go into the more mass market. So this trust and autonomy needs to adapt over time, but in particular, you need to have that trust. You need to give autonomy to that local team that is actually uncovering localizations and finding ways to get traction in the market. Then in the bottom left, you have communication and clarity, which is, we often refer to the concept of feedback loops. So that it's not just mechanisms for headquarters to share information with local teams, but also for local teams to be able to share things with headquarters to help enable what we refer to as two-way innovation. So that it's not just command and control headquarters saying, here's what you need to do, here's how to innovate, but so that there are mechanisms so that when a best practice happens in a local market, headquarters is able to understand it and share it and implement it in other markets where it makes sense as well. So that really supercharges things. It also, through these feedback loops, allows for local teams to communicate with each other so that headquarters doesn't have to be that connecting point. And then finally, the fourth commitment is around what we call the global agile methodology, which is a global layer on top of agile that I'll talk about in a couple minutes. We also found, to the point of mindset at the individual level, that there were these catalysts that really made the difference for growth for these fast-growing companies. And so we invented a new word. We call these people entrepreneurs, as in international. So this is not a typo of entrepreneur, but it's a new layer on top of it that hasn't been talked about as much. So if you look at this pyramid, at the bottom is being entrepreneurial, the agile or growth mindset. The next level up, and entrepreneurship obviously been around forever. The next level up is the company mindset, sometimes referred to as being an intrapreneur. And this is something over the last 15 years or so, organizations of all sizes have looked for in their companies, where in their new hires and team building, where it's people who are agile and entrepreneurial, but can work in the complexity and bureaucracy of an established organization. But what hasn't been talked about as much that we think is the mindset of the next decade is a cultural mindset. Global mindedness, cultural curiosity, cultural sensitivity, the empathy to understand other markets, to localize a business for that market. And we didn't just make this up ourselves. We talked to fast-growing companies like Amazon, Shopify, others, and they told us, when we're building our pipeline of leadership talent, you need to have international experience because we see ourselves as a global business and we know that mindset is important. And so just to go around with some of the pictures here on the page, on the far right is Abe Smith. He's head of international at Zoom. And one thing we found that was interesting was a lot of these people who gravitated toward these expansion leadership positions had formative experiences that showed them there was a world beyond their backyard. So for Abe, after going to college on the East Coast of the United States, he moved to Japan, where he taught English at a tiny Japanese fishing village. And again, that just showed him there was this opportunity beyond the US and really set his career on a different path. In the middle is Troy Malone. He headed international for Evernote and Weebly and other companies as well. He actually was on a church mission in Korea. On the far left is Catherine Himes. She used to lead international product localization for Slack, and she was the first non-Chinese intern at Baidu, which is the Google of China. And so just some examples of that. But ultimately, this team building thing is not just the most important thing from what we heard in our research, but also one of the hardest things. And it's not just about getting a sales executive and they're going to come up with a solution to everything. There's a lot more to thinking through the model. And so what we did is we created a team building framework to help organizations think about when they're building local teams, what are all the ingredients you need to be successful? And so this yellow diamond in the middle of the graphic, it might be a unicorn person that doesn't exist. So it might be collectively amongst multiple people, you want to have these characteristics, but it's important that you have all of them. And so in the upper left, you have that entrepreneur mindset we talked about, the agile mindset, the company mindset, that cultural mindset as well. In the upper right, we have leadership skills for distributed teams. So being away from headquarters, you need to have certain skills around autonomous decision-making, high integrity, being able to influence authority from afar, removing obstacles. All of those things are very important. And then at the bottom in particular, this is really important. So an overlap between local knowledge and company knowledge. And so the traditional thing that companies would do is what is often referred to as like the expatriate model, where you would take someone from headquarters, send them to that country. But what often happened is that person, they didn't understand the local context, especially not at a native level. And there was this sort of ivory tower leftover, like almost like colonization type imperialistic viewpoint. They stay kind of disconnected from the local culture, to and from the office with their driver kind of mindset. Now, on the other side, just hiring someone local, but not making sure they understand how the company works and giving them that company knowledge, that can be problemsome as well. And so what do I mean by these two terms? Local knowledge is things like language skills, local relationships, local business culture. Company knowledge are things like core value and company culture alignment. The ability to get things done internally, which can be difficult if you're a new hire in a local market, you don't have that know-how of how to do things, and then trust being built. And we talked about that importance of trust and autonomy. And to get that company knowledge, it's not just having someone come to headquarters for a week for orientation. It's creating much more mindful ways of developing that expertise. And there's lots of different examples of strategies. No one of them is particularly right, but some examples. BlaBlaCar, as we mentioned before with Spain and France, they hired the team to work at headquarters locally, then go back to the country that they lived in after living there for a period of time. ThoughtWorks, a software consulting firm, they have a co-GM model where they bring someone from headquarters and then they hire a GM locally who work together. Plaid, a financial services like fintech company, they send someone over from headquarters whose goal is to hire and train that one person, and then they roll off and go back to headquarters. Uber is known for having launch teams. So they would hire a team, they would have very custom metrics. So their metrics weren't around revenue, their metrics are around one, hiring the next team, and two, making sure that you could pick up a ride from the city center in that metro within 5 minutes. Once those two things happen, then it was time for that launch team to move to another place. There's also teams, we can't say the name of it, but some would intentionally hire an early customer or hire a partner in that local market to take on that local leadership role. And then I had mentioned this earlier, the bottom right in terms of commitments of those 4 commitments for achieving global scale is the global agile methodology. And so one of the big findings from our research was that the lean methodology does not work great in a global context. And the reason why is, for those familiar, The whole idea of lean is to pivot and iterate and change until you find your right model, until you find product market fit. Really good for one market. If you do that in 10 different markets, now you have 10 different models that are very, very hard to manage. And so we created a global layer on top that was endorsed by Eric Ries, Alex Osterwalder, if you're familiar with the business model canvas, and Steve Blank, sort of father of modern entrepreneurship. All of them have endorsed this. But what you need to do, if you look on, it's a two-step process. The first step on the left is discovering hypothesis development. Then you go to preparation, validation, implementation. But in step one, you revisit that model that worked in Brazil. You don't want to say, we're going to do things the company way, we're going to do things the Brazilian way, because you won't be as successful with that. But at the same time, you don't want to just completely change everything, because then you run into that problem where after you enter a few markets, you hit a brick wall and you realize, oh, we did not plan properly for scale. So we need to take a step back, stall our growth, and rebuild from the beginning, which costs a lot of money and loses out on opportunity while you're doing that. And so we talk about how you need to go through a process that we call localization discovery, where you go into those markets and face-to-face talk to key stakeholders to better understand them. Like one of the great stories we heard from an early Airbnb executive in the Asia Pacific region, they actually had the team during the holidays one year from Airbnb, Brian Chechki and the whole executive team come and actually observe Korean customers using their app through like a one-way mirror. So they were literally looking over the shoulder, seeing what they were doing in the app. There's such power in seeing things in person and better understanding the market. You also realized over time that often what you might have researched from afar may not be the reality when you actually get there in person. So a good story we heard was from Evernote. Troy Malone, who was in the middle of the pyramid picture from before. For Evernote, they wanted to launch in India, and they were targeting like an upwardly mobile, like young professional population. And for Evernote, their payment processing is with credit cards. In their research, it looked pretty good credit card penetration. But then when Troy went into market and he talked to everybody, including everyday people, like his taxi drivers, waiters and waitresses at restaurants, the people who check him in at hotels, he said all of them had what he called auntie stories. Like they had an aunt or uncle who had another family member who got a credit card, racked up a bunch of debt, and ruined their life. So they all heard these stories about how dangerous credit cards are. So a lot of them had credit cards, but nobody used them because they were too scared. And so if they had gone to market with credit card processing as their payment mechanism, they would not have been very successful. Instead, they used another type of local payment solution. So what we found is that often there's not a lot of structure around this process that you go through in order to figure out what changes you need to make to your model to be successful in a new market. So as Klaus mentioned earlier, you're going to be spending time later on this week actually looking at the papers in front of you and going through this process. But just to explain at a high level, and Klaus will go into more detail, basically what you want to do is take your validated model from Brazil or whatever your initial market is, and then you come up with a key set of questions you need to ask related to each of these categories. And we'll talk about what each of these categories mean. And then in order to get your hypotheses for that local market, you run everything through two key filters. One of them is government and regulation, and the other is culture that affect all aspects of your business. So as an example, one of these categories is sales premium. And with sales premium, that one of the subcategories is a distribution, as an example. And so that often comes through the form of partnerships. Well, in some countries, they do not let an international company own 100% of a local entity. So you have to get a local JV partner, joint venture partner, in order to operate legally. On the culture side, there's lots of stories we've told, but has anybody ever been to Japan on the call? Anybody? Okay, so you may or may not be familiar, but in Japan, They don't use handwritten signatures. That is not legally binding. What are these Hanko stamps. And so if DocuSign, the e-signature platform, had taken more of that disruptive company way approach, they would have gone to Japan and said, oh, these Hanko things are ancient. They're a thing of the past. We're the future. But they understood the cultural significance. And so they actually partnered with this company here called Shachihata, which makes ink and these Hanko stamps and other Hanko related materials. So not a technology company, to create an e-Hanko, an electronic Hanko stamp. And because of that, even though they had to give away some economics to this non-tech partner, they got such cultural credibility that they took off very quickly and became the market leader there in Japan. So this is an initial step one of this global agile process. So yes, you have to localize, but you also need to manage the complexity that comes along with that localization. And when we talk about localization, it goes farther than just changing, the language or something like that at the company. It really goes to all aspects of the company. One of the stories we like to tell that shows how far this localization goes is with Zendesk. Raise your hand if you've heard of Zendesk. Okay, a couple hands. So they're a customer service platform. They're headquartered in San Francisco in this neighborhood called the Tenderloin, where there are a lot of homeless people and a lot of like drug use out on the street and things like that. And so for them, their area of community impact they focused on, because they're a very community-minded company, was around fighting poverty and reducing homelessness. So they opened up an office in Singapore, and I don't know if you've been to Singapore, but the Singaporean employees were like, this is great, but we don't have homelessness here. This doesn't make any sense to us. This doesn't connect with us. But there was some kind of government regulation where once you hit age 62, most everyone is forced out of the workforce. It's like forced into early retirement. So there is a lot of depression and isolation of senior citizens. And so that was an area the local team was passionate about. So they localized their community mindedness to better fit the local market. And so when it comes to localization, as I was talking about before, it's often an afterthought. You just go, you're like, let's speed. We're going to go and get traction in the market. Go, go, go. And then they hit a wall. Not great, right? Also, depending on who you speak to in your team, they have very narrow views of international. The head of sales will say, well, we have this partner already. They're also located in this other country, so we should go there. Or, legal counsel will say, well, legally, this is the easiest place to go. We should go there. There's not a really great holistic way to look at it. And we were told when you're communicating at a C-level or board level, it's often very hard to describe what localizations are needed in order to be successful in the market. So we created what we call the localization premium analysis. And so this is a pretty picture output of a more detailed analysis you go through. But just to explain it, product market fit in your initial market is in the middle. And we use the word initial market very intentionally, because if you have a company from Brazil or the US, often that initial market is your home market because it's big enough. But if you're from a smaller country, if you're from Uruguay or Venezuela or Israel, like smaller markets where you know that you cannot create a scaled up business in a market that small, you often will choose another market like Brazil or other places in order to initially launch and scale in. The top part is go-to-market related. The bottom part is operational. And you can see in there faintly, there's an iceberg. And the reason why we use that iceberg analogy is because often companies only think about the top part. They think about changing language, changing the pricing to fit local currency, about changing the marketing messages. But really, that is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much under the surface. And so just to explain each of these categories, on the top left is marketing premium. That's differences in use case, differences in value proposition, target customer, competitive landscape, marketing channel, advertising messages, etc. Sales premium That's differences in revenue model or pricing, differences in partner vendor strategy and distribution, direct versus indirect, differences in customer service. In Asia, as an example, in US, for a lot of software companies, they just have an online help desk or a chat bot. In Asia, you need to have a call center where they can talk to a person because culturally that's important. And then product premium is in the top right, differences in product or feature changes. One example that I remember is with LinkedIn. So LinkedIn was expanding into India more. Well, the mobile network in India is pretty bad by comparison. It's like a 2G network in a lot of places, as opposed to a 4 or 5G network in other countries. And so their app did not load very well. It's very graphic and photo heavy. So they had to create a new version of their app that they internally called LinkedIn Lite that was very text-based for that market. So it loaded more quickly on these lower bandwidth mobile networks. Then on the bottom, operationally, on the bottom right is infrastructure premium. For physical products, that's things like supply chain. For software products, that's things like tech stack. Let's say you want to go to Germany. Because of customer privacy, GDPR rules, German citizens' data cannot leave Germany. So you have to stand up a new tech stack in Germany in order to comply with those local laws, as an example. On the far right is admin premium. So that is whether you have to create a new corporate entity, taxation, government regulation and compliance, transfer pricing, getting money in and out of the country, trading currencies, just local politics, lots of elements there. And then finally at the bottom, organization premium. Do you have to hire a new team to serve that market, or do you have an existing team that can serve that market? Are there differences in business culture between that country and where you're already located? And do you have what we call momentum builders, the structures and processes in place to be successful? So let's just go through a few examples. One, I'm sure you'll be familiar with. Yes, Apple has been around for decades, but a lot of their international retail expansion has happened over the last decade. And so when they went into Brazil, they had to think about things differently. We have a couple teammates from Brazil, and one of our teammates, Victor, when he goes to other countries for our programs, one of the first things he does is he goes to an Apple store, because in Brazil, as you know, like because of tariffs, an iPhone is like 3 times the price as it would normally be. And so Apple had to take a very different approach to the market. They had to change their break-even analysis because there's not as much sales that they would focus on. They had to hire and train employees a bit differently because of this different go-to-market. There's also labor unions that play a more prominent role in Brazil versus the US. They changed their whole in-store layout to be more Genius Bar service-focused instead of sales-focused. And then Apple had gone paperless already. You did everything on iPads. Well, there's a local law that you have to print a receipt on nota fiscal. I don't think I'm saying that right, but you know, that special paper you have to put it on, right? So they had to change their processes. And even more recently, there was an issue where Apple said, we're going to stop selling chargers with our products, right? Well, that's against the law in Brazil, right? You need to give a customer everything they need to operate in order to be in order to sell something legally. So Apple had to figure that whole process out of what to do. Otherwise, they couldn't sell any of their devices in country. We also noticed what we call a familiarity bias. So companies often will go to countries where the language is the same or where it's geographically nearby, geographic proximity, and that might not always be the best solution. So for US companies, that answer is often, oh, well, let's go to the UK and Australia and Canada because they all speak English, right? Or within Latin America, let's go, to these other Spanish-speaking countries because they all speak Spanish. Or, let's go to Portugal because they speak Portuguese, right? So that's not always the best answer. And we had a great case study here with Square, where not only was the model in the UK and Australia when they entered those markets, not only was it different than the US, but they were very different than each other. And Brexit, because England was leaving the European Union, that caused a lot of admin premium because a lot of the compliance was a moving target. They didn't know exactly the rules they had to live by because they were in the process of changing. Another concept that we found is what we call a linked market or influencer market strategy / connections. And so we use Airbnb as an example, where they were looking to expand into Asia Pacific. And normally a company would look and say, China is the biggest population, we should go there. Or Japan has the most developed economy, the largest income per capita, we should go there. And what Airbnb understood was that Korea was an influencer market for Japan and China, because a lot of Japanese and Chinese consumers in the travel space would look to Korean influencers for the next hot thing. So by them choosing Korea first and localizing for that market, then when they went to Japan and China after, the amount of complexity they incurred was less. So they ended up creating more speed and momentum around their growth in the area. Another story we like to tell, and you're probably familiar with this. So I have my Brazilian ketchup here. So Heinz ketchup, from the US, they came to learn about how Brazilians and Americans like to use ketchup and eat their hamburgers differently, right? So in America, what do we like to do? We like to open up the top here, squeeze a ton of it out on our burger, close the burger, and take a bunch of bites and just eat the rest of it, right? But how do a lot of people in Brazil like to eat their hamburger, right? Often you like to just squeeze a little bit on a bite, take a bite, squeeze a little bit more on a bite, take a bite. It's kind of hard to do that. Often, especially with the burger, you need two hands. And so what are you doing? You're taking the burger, holding it, squeezing a little bit, putting the burger down, closing this, putting it back up, taking a bite, and then doing that again every single bite you want. It just doesn't work. So what Heinz ended up doing is they created a new nozzle that didn't stick out. So the one in the United States, it sticks out so you couldn't stand it up on the top like this. And there's basically a top that stays open. So it's very easy for you to take it real quick, squeeze a little bit, put it back down on the table, take your bite, squeeze a little bit, take your bite. So there's all sorts of different type of localizations that you have to think about. To go through a tech example, raise your hand if you use Slack. We got one hand, okay, two hands, cool. All right, so when Slack started, there was no send button. You would, if you've been using it for a long time, you would just hit enter, and then it would send the message. That's fine, especially for a lot of Western business culture communications. In a lot of Western business cultures, you send more frequent, shorter messages. Well, in Asian business culture, this ended up creating a lot of anxiety for their employees, because in Asian business culture, you often write very long, very well thought out messages. And so the reason why there was anxious employees is because they would be typing something and they thought, what if I accidentally hit enter and then it sends, and then I have to recall the message and edit it, and I don't look very organized, I don't seem very professional. And so one of the stated goal, like core values with Slack, was to remove friction from communication, make it as simple as possible. So while this seems like an insignificant thing, this was a big deal at Slack. They had to decide, are we going to add a send button in certain markets? And so when they entered Japan and realized this, they ended up creating that send button to better localize for that market, to help them get deeper penetration and get rid of some of that anxiety that was existing around employees there. So the other thing we're finding is that that concept I was talking about before, initial markets versus home markets. And while it's pretty traditional to see someone come from a small market, like Zendesk came from Denmark, but very early on, their initial market was the United States. We're also seeing it go the other way as well. So there's a company that's headquartered in Silicon Valley that's raised a lot of Silicon Valley capital that's called Zipline. They're a medical drone delivery company. But instead of the United States as their initial market, their initial markets have been in East Africa, countries like Rwanda. And part of the reason is because they're delivering medical supplies. Well, in the United States, the transportation of medical supplies and those logistics are pretty well developed. Also, you're not allowed to fly drones wherever you want in the United States. Air traffic control is very much restrictive of those things. But in Rwanda, they don't have that supply chain set up, and you can fly drones wherever you want. So they literally send hundreds of flights a day. So as Hiro here says, you can put lawyers on legal issues, but you can't pay yourself out of cultural issues. So culture is another huge thing that affects really all aspects of an organization, is one of the big, what we call the pillars for enabling global growth. And we talk about 3 different types of culture. So there is local market culture, the beliefs, behaviors, customer criteria for purchasing, things like that. A sub element of that is the local business culture, how business is conducted, how your local operations would operate. And you need to compare that to company culture, because often they conflict with each other. So, for example, one of the stories we heard was from a former head of international at Apple in China. And so what happened was they were doing their normal quarterly reviews of different things, and they thought they noticed a discrepancy in the accounting. And they ended up interviewing the whole staff there, and everyone said, nope, there's no problems, all of this is good. But they realized that everybody was lying to protect the boss. Now, in Western business culture, in American business culture, one of the top priorities is integrity and honesty. So if you look at this situation, it's pretty easy. Fire them all. They all lied. Integrity is the most important thing. But in Chinese business culture, priorities go to saving face and protecting the boss. And so how do you navigate those type of situations where people are acting in accordance with their local business culture and those different cultures conflict? And so it's important to make sure that local teams understand the cultures. And one thing that's really important is going through a process that we call universalizing core values, to make sure that the core values are actually resonating with a more broad audience and not just those from the home country. So Walmart is a great example. Walmart, one of their core values is respect the individual. Sounds good to a US audience, maybe to a certain extent a Brazilian audience, but in Asian markets, it's a much more collective culture. That would not resonate at all. And what ended up happening, Rakuten, the Japanese e-commerce platform, they had expanded, and for them, as you can see from one of their case studies here, or one of their core values, speed was most important. So they often would acquire a new company as part of their expansion. Well, they acquired this company in the United Kingdom to have more of a presence in Europe, and they were pushing them to accept the company's core values, speed, go to market. And morale was really low. They weren't hitting their targets. Something was wrong there. And so Saichu-san, who's one of the co-founders of Rakuten, who's here in this picture, he ended up going there, and he realized that the company hadn't done some more basic foundational steps around buy-in and around cultural alignment that needed to be done. And so what he actually did was he put up paper on the wall and took the team there, had an all-hands meeting, and said, what is important in English business culture? And wrote all of it out there on the wall, and then mapped each of those different core values or elements of culture to the core values of Rakuten to show the connections that they had. And ultimately, morale went up, results got better. There was much better alignment because of going through that extra step. We also found that there is this 4th type of culture that was emerging. For a long time, a lot of culture is identified by national boundaries. But now, because of online platforms and other tools, people are connecting all across the world based on common interests, common beliefs. All of these niches are carving out. And so Airbnb saw this, and one of their community cultures, is what we call it, was the community culture around marathon runners. So anytime they went into new countries, they tapped into this community culture, these marathon runners, in order to get early traction. Just by nature, it's well aligned with Airbnb. Marathon runners tend to be more adventurous, maybe than some other segments, but they also have this common language and set of beliefs around embracing the adventure around doing new things, around, being dedicated to their training, other things, around being outdoors in nature. And so they tapped into those to enter new markets more successfully and build those foundations. When you go back to that spider chart, the localization premium analysis, one of the parts at the bottom was the organization premium. And one of the things I referenced was the importance around building what we call momentum builders, which are structures and processes to support scale. Things like playbooks are really, really important that often aren't thought about until much later in the process. One of the things that we find that is missing is that right organizational support during the localization process. And that's why we recommend companies create what we call the localization resource team, or LRT. And so what often happens, imagine you have a local team here on the right, you have a local general manager, and he or she uncovers a potential localization that's needed. Well, what typically happens? That person has got to go figure out at headquarters, how do I get the engineering team or the sales team or the product team or legal team to go make this change in order to fit for our local market? So what are they doing? They're looking away from getting traction in the market and uncovering other localizations to go figure out how to do this at headquarters. Very distracting, keeps you away from building that traction. So in building this localization resource team, which we recommend often has some kind of project manager front door, and then has cross-functional representation from all the different functions, that person doesn't have to be dedicated just to this where their whole focus is on it, but at least a representative from that organization. Then what happens is when that local GM has that localization that's needed, he or she gives it to the localization resource team, and they go see it to completion in those organizations. Then that GM and her team goes and continues to focus on building traction in the market. The other benefit is over time, you understand what works and what doesn't work when it comes to expansion. So instead of wasting your time doing the same thing over and over, a brain trust is being created around best practices. And then this team can also set up guardrails. This can change, this can't change. It sort of sets those boundaries to better control the complexity that's coming along with localizing in these different markets. And so there's tons of examples. One actually is with Slack, where we intend this to be a little bit more operational focus. And what happens is when you have this team, executive visibility becomes a lot more easy. So you don't have to go to every single department to figure out what's happening. You go to one single place and you get a view on what all the localizations happening are. So you can do this from an operational level. What Slack did was they also actually had this at a strategic level. So they had a cross-functional team. So basically both the local markets and this strategic cross-functional team were giving directions to their operational localization resource team to then help manage the localization process. Flexport, the freight forwarding company, they had a representative from the product team who actually sat in market in Europe and interacted with the different general managers across the world to pull in different product changes that were needed to localize for each of their regions. And then there's an overarching management model that ties a lot of these concepts we've been talking about together. And we use the analogy of a bridge. In a way, you and your company are looking to build a bridge between your company and the local markets you want to enter. So on the far left, you have headquarters. On the far right, you have the local markets. And then you have these two towers. On the right side, on the left side, you have those momentum builders like the localization resource team, supported by the global agile methodology process that we were talking about. And then you have the local team, again, supported by global agile, but this team is then focused on, if you look to the right on the road that's connecting all of this, they're focused on uncovering localization to better connect in with the market. So this road that goes in between, on the left, you have the vision and core values and goals, OKRs, whatever you use, that headquarters is pushing on to the different teams, to the different local teams. And then in between, you have this constant communication and translation that's happening between local teams and headquarters, those feedback loops we talked about, to allow for two-way innovation, so that when localizations are uncovered here, there's a mechanism to send those back to headquarters, in addition to that core value alignment coming from headquarters. And then for those familiar with the architecture of a suspension bridge, you know that it's those cables that are actually supporting the structure. And so that main cable company culture must be consistent throughout. And then there's these trust points, these vertical cables that must exist throughout as well. And so there's lots of ways you can go about building these things. One story we heard again from Rakuten. This is Mikitani-san, one of the co-founders and CEO. And in order to help manage things at scale, every Monday he has what they call an asakai, sort of a level set, kind of like a town hall, but not exactly, where core values are communicated, updates are communicated. But part of where it shows this global class mindedness is in the fact that it's done in multiple languages, it's done multiple times on different time zones. And then for people that are not on those exact time zones, it's also disseminated at the beginning of the day so that they see it right when they get into the office to start their work that week. So there's a lot of examples in our book about these global class companies. Canva, the Australian design platform, is a good example. Melanie Perkins, one of their founders here, she had that entrepreneur mindset we've been talking about. They built a very diverse team. We've worked with some companies. One that we talked to in Korea, they have about 600 employees, and Klaus was talking to them and asked, how many languages do you speak amongst these 600 employees? And they kind of nervously laughed and said 3. Well, if you look at the other side, Canva, of their first 200 or 300 employees at their headquarters, over 70 languages were spoken. So a lot of diversity had been built into the company DNA. They also had very strong goals around localization. They had a goal that within 1 year, they would localize for 100 different languages. And while they didn't do it in a year, I think it took them like a year and a half. That's still incredible speed to do that. They had local templates and things that fit those local markets. They also universalized their core values, so they didn't just resonate with an Australian customer or an Australian employee base, but a global employee base. And they even were mindful of how headquarters needed to be an enabler. And so in their Slack channels, they actually removed parts of Slack channel names that had headquarters in those, because it was often very limiting to people who were just in Australia. So we've also created different tools. Like one thing we do is we help companies essentially take a better understanding of their global readiness. Like what often happens is companies will focus on markets. Okay, here's the market we want to go to. Is there market readiness? Is there opportunity in those markets? But they don't think about their organizational readiness and all these topics we've been talking about over the last hour or so. And so we can help evaluate what your global readiness is. And then on the bottom axis, that's that localization premium, that spider chart, the amount of complexity that comes along with entering those different new markets. And so, Klaus just shared a link here. There's a free assessment you can take to help you understand your company's readiness. And the idea is, through some of these tools and exercises and program we're doing with you, is we help expand this green zone, this readiness zone, so you have more capability to capture more markets and make that high risk zone smaller, where there's a higher likelihood of failure. So we also have built a great community. One thing we found is that the international expansion experience was a very solitary experience. The people focused on international were often very apart from the core of the company. Everyone's focused mainly on Brazil or the main markets you're in, and less so on the expansion side. And so we've created this robust community of people who have expertise in this space that we plug into. So we'll stop for a minute. Would love to answer any questions anyone has about any of this content. And then, like we talked about, later this week, Klaus will be taking you through a more formal exercise where you'll go more into that business model localization canvas that you have in front of you on paper. So we'll stop for a minute. What different questions do you have?
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Sure.
Pessoal, estamos com perguntas, dúvidas aí. Se tiver alguma coisa aí, também pode mandar em português e a gente faz a tradução aqui.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I have a small company, and I think the main problem starts with the language. For example, I want to go to Latin America. I think the language, the Spanish language is the first step I need to go. But one thing I think you told is about that I can hire people from other countries, not from my country, or partnerships. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so all that we've created here is things that can help make this process simpler and easier and faster for you. As you can probably tell, a lot of this is based on this lean iterative methodology. And what we've found is that traditionally, international has been this like big deal. You go hire a team, a bunch of people in a market, you have this big formal launch and, like a ribbon cutting in your office. And what we're suggesting is you can find ways to be much more iterative about it before you commit as much time and capital to things. And so the fact that you have a smaller company, it's fine. These tools can help you not get distracted, help you focus on what you should be focusing on. But it is hiring people in different markets is a great way to better understand the culture, to better gain entry to those markets, to better tap into existing relationships. Also, depending on the market, it's very good in showing your commitment to that market. Because if you just kind of come in for a trip, hey, we're going to go to Colombia, say hi, okay, meet some people, and then, they never see you again. That's very different than if you can say, we have employees there. So I'll give a perfect example. For Global Class, our company, Brazil is a very important market. And that's why we have Victor and Fernando in market, who we hired because we are very committed to growing in Brazil. And you could probably tell that probably shows a little more credibility when we're talking to you. And, some of the examples we're using around Apple and ketchup and things like that to connect and show our understanding and commitment to things. And a great way to get that, we didn't know about these type of things until, we were told about them in our research or they were brought to our attention from our team. Does that answer your question? Good, cool.
All right, anyone else? Mais alguém pode abrir o microfone, gente? Ou Diego?
Yeah, hello, Aaron. Pleasure to meet you.
Yes.
We are a hardware house. We are a small startup in Brazil. We have less than 10 employees at the moment. And we are planning to expand mostly because some of our founders live here in Europe.
Okay.
Right. And we have a multicultural team in different continents. And we started right when the pandemic hit. So we were all remote for the first 2 years, doing things in a small lab where we were trying to get together. And now things expanded a little bit internally in Brazil. And we are planning to go worldwide. So my question is, what would be the most important things when you're building hardware? It's a tangible thing, it's a thing that you can see, to take care when you're expanding, right? Because a lot of things impact there, like production and availability of components, so on, different regulations in different countries and so on. What do you think are the key points that should be taken care?
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, by the way.
Of course, thank you. One thing that's important is around what the process we call localization premium or localization discovery, where you're going and doing research in the market. You really need to understand those things and talk to key stakeholders, in particular when it comes to supply chain and customs and regulation. We're not supposed to talk about this story and say the company's name, but it's a payment processing company that is named after a shape that looks like this. And they were expanding into Korea. And 1 week before their expansion, everything was ready to go. They realized their point of sale box did not fit in a standard Korean mailbox slot. It was a couple millimeters off, very small. So they had to pull back their whole launch, redo all of their packaging, and, you know, everything from suppliers, all those different things, the inventory they had, all because they didn't understand that nuanced of a piece of understanding things. They also, another story was when they were in Australia and they did some testing around shipping. Well, what ended up happening was they did a lot of their testing using ground shipping. They didn't actually do some of the flight shipping. And as you know, I don't know exactly what your product is, but if you have lithium ion batteries, there are certain regulations around shipping them. And so it ended up that the different carriers they were going to work with would not ship their products via air. And so they had to deal with all of those different complexities. So especially because you're building something physical, understand that stuff on the front end. I think the other thing that you want to be careful about too is around market selection. So one of the big things we like to talk, so often what can happen is there's a bias, and this can happen within multicultural teams as well, but you think because I have experience in this one market, we should go there. Like we've heard things like a founder studied abroad in this other country when they were in college and they liked it, so I'm going to go there. That doesn't always mean that it's the best criteria. You need to think of custom criteria that helps you. Like a really good story I like to use to show this example. I know it's not as popular to talk about as for a number of reasons, which you'll hear in a second when I say the country. But if you remember, I talked about BlaBlaCar. BlaBlaCar had an amazing launch and quick traction in Russia. And the reason why is because, well, like, and I don't know how it is in Brazil, but I know in the United States, hitchhiking, giving rides to strangers, our parents, when we were growing up, said, never do that. You're going to get robbed and murdered, and that's horrible. It's not safe. But in Russia, during the Soviet Union and during communist times, not a lot of people had cars. So everybody, anytime you saw anyone on the side of the road, you would, go give them a ride. It was the right thing to do. So there was a culture around things as well. So think about those elements in addition to the normal market growth, population size things that you're already looking at. Sound good?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Os tímidos? Ou tímidas? No? All righty. Aaron, I think that's a wrap. I don't think we have any more questions right now.
Great. One more thing I'll share just at the bottom here. Are Klaus and my email addresses. So just Klaus at or Aaron at globalclasscompany.com. We'd love to connect with you. Like was put in the chat. If you that assessment is a great free tool to give you an idea of where your company is at in terms of thinking or process around some of these key areas. And so, we'd love to have a conversation with you, or you can bring it up during the next session when you're talking to Klaus about some of the things you learned from that process. It probably takes 10 minutes to complete, but it'll give you some good insights.
Perfect. Thank you. Pessoal, é o seguinte, recadinhos rápidos aqui, então, hoje a gente vai encerrar aqui a sessão, se não tiver mais nenhuma dúvida. O Aaron e o Klaus, na verdade, colocou aí o link para vocês fazerem a avaliação aí de vocês, acho que é super importante isso. Quinta-feira a gente volta com o Klaus, o pessoal presencial está aí com Canvas, que a gente vai usar na semana que vem, se quiser levar, a gente tem mais cópia aqui também, não tem problema não. Pessoal do online, eu vou enviar isso para vocês, então fiquem atentos aos e-mails, eu vou colocar aqui também no grupo, aqui no Zoom, na próxima sessão, no próximo workshop. E na semana que vem, workshop de pitch, para construir o pitch deck de vocês em inglês, tá? Então é isso que a gente vai fazer para a próxima sessão, para depois a gente fazer os matchmakings. Foi gravado, a gente vai disponibilizar a gravação, para caso vocês tenham, enfim, queiram aprofundar um pouco mais, ver de novo, alguma coisa assim, vou disponibilizar para vocês, ok? And that's it. Aaron, thank you so very much. Is Klaus still in the meeting? No, I don't see him. Is he here?
He had to drop off, but he will be here later this week, and look forward to that session. And hopefully this session sparked some questions, some thoughts in your head, and that's part of why it's great that we're talking again later this week, so you can bring some of those things up, and we'll go through that business model localization canvas exercise.
Perfect. And people here are shy. Brazilians at first, they're a little bit shy, but then you're going to see a lot of questions popping up, Aaron.
Sounds good.
Thank you so very much. And if I don't see you next session, I'll see you in a couple of weeks here.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. Tchau, tchau.
Tchau. Pessoal, encerrada a sessão. Muito obrigado e até quinta.
Bye bye. Tchau, tchau.